I think that's fair. And obviously, stability is important. Let's pivot to the part of the world that is not stable right now. And, well, one of, I guess you could say, because we've got Ukraine as well. But Israel Hamas war, in terms of what's on your radar right now with regard to developments there?
Release of some hostages appears to be imminent. I know people have been saying that for the last few weeks, but truly a deal seems to be just about inked. That will be a positive, of course, for the Israelis at home, of course, for the Americans. And I think everybody wants to see a lot of those hostages coming home. It's been 6 weeks. And I mean, we're not just talking about, military age men. We're talking about women. We're talking about children that have been held. And so any success there, which in turn would lead to what we're hearing would be a 5-day humanitarian pause in fighting that maybe could facilitate some direct diplomacy, not between Israel and Hamas, certainly, but perhaps between the Israelis and the Palestinian Authority, perhaps between the Israelis and some of the Gulf states, the Jordanians, the Egyptians. That would be welcome. The Americans will try. So let's see. But at the same time, we're seeing more violence in the West Bank. We're seeing more violence between Hezbollah and the Israeli Defense Forces as well. So we are still in a context where, I mean, people are talking about a ceasefire, but the reality is trying to contain this from getting much worse. That is still the reality as to where the war is right now.
Before we move on, just one question there. Is there a possibility of a ceasefire working against Israel because it gives time for, in essence, the enemies to regroup?
Of course. I mean, that is the downside, is that any day you're not fighting is a day that your enemy can try to conceal where they are, how they're operating, better plan for attacks against Israel. I will say that we have to recognize that there are two wars going on here. There's the military fighting on the ground where the Israelis are overwhelmingly the more powerful country. Gaza is not a country, I mean, to be fair, but I mean territory. The Israelis have the intelligence, they have the technology, they have a much larger armed forces, much better trained. And the fact that Hamas was able to commit the terrorist atrocities they were is in large part because the Israelis took their eye off the ball. But that's not happening now. So I will say that on balance, I'm a little less concerned about, existential threat to Israel from not fighting for a week or two or three. And I am more concerned about the impact of the Israelis losing the information war. And they are losing the information war. Maybe that's not fair. Because, of course, Hamas is more responsible for the deaths of Palestinian civilians than the Israelis are. They're not wholly responsible. Israel has some responsibility, but the Palestinians are more. They're not. The fact is that the way the rest of the world perceives this is increasingly, despite the acts of October 7th, that Israel is responsible.
Right.
And
I think you're right.
Some of that is because there are a lot more Muslims. Some of that is because there's anti-Semitism. Some of that is just because of the sheer numbers of Palestinian civilians getting killed and not recognizing that Hamas is operating in those hospitals, is operating, in those civilian areas. But, it may not be fair that the Israelis are losing the information war, but they are. And so if you're Israel, you have to factor that in. Because if you start losing public opinion in the United States, you start losing the Democrats in the United States, and they're running the country right now, that can have permanent impact on Israel.
Sure.
And refusing to accept that reality as part of the fight is a very serious challenge.